Gas and oil exports represent the bedrock of the Russian economy. It's estimated that roughly half of state revenue comes through the sale of hydrocarbon energy. Gazprom is the corporation responsible for marketing Russia's vast quantity of natural gas. The state owns a majority of shares, therein making the company not only a major source of government funding, but also an apparatus of Russian soft power. In the European Union, Russian natural gas accounts for 30% of the market. In France and Italy, Gazprom provides approximately a quarter of all consumed gas. The company covers a third of all gas used in Germany. Gazprom's strongest holdings are in Eastern Europe, where it tends to maintain a majority of the market. Client countries are supplied through thousands of miles of pipeline streams. Of the 4 streams channeling into Europe, 2 run through Ukraine. The company has received a reputation for allegedly abusing its market dominance and lack of competition. EU leadership has accused Gazprom of imposing artificial price hikes upon client nations as punishment for not aligning with Moscow's interests. Russia has shown a willingness to sever gas during disputes, most notably in 2009, where a dispute between Gazprom and Ukraine's national gas company led to a shutdown of Ukraine's supply. Russia claimed it was necessary to prevent Ukraine from illegally siphoning until matters were resolved. However, depriving Ukraine of gas meant having to choke off client nations further down the stream network. The cutoff lasted a tense 13 days and left the European community all the more wary of their reliance on Gazprom and the leverage it afforded Moscow. The EU had sought to put the gas behemoth in check beginning in 2007, charging it with unfair business actions and market manipulation. In each instance, Gazprom was dismissive of its charges and claimed its unique status as a strategic government-controlled business provided it with immunity, in addition to claiming it was outside of EU jurisdiction. It therefore made it clear grievances against the company would have to be taken up with the Russian government itself. Charges lingered without progress, as the EU appeared to lack the political resolve to challenge Moscow on behalf of its affected members. In 2012, Russian President Vladimir Putin went so far as to issue an edict prohibiting government-controlled businesses from obeying foreign regulators. The move appeared to have effect. The following year, an EU commission targeting Gazprom decided not to risk relations with Moscow and went against pressing charges, seeking a deal instead. That's where things stood when crisis broke out in Crimea. If Brussels had lacked the will to face Moscow on behalf of its own members, how far was it willing to pressure Russia on behalf of a non-member state? With Gazprom entrenched throughout the continent, Russia looked to have an effective deterrent in keeping the EU from becoming too bold. But Brussels was at its end with Moscow's intimidation tactics and took the offensive. The South Stream pipeline project was intended to channel gas across the Black Sea, where it would arrive in Bulgaria and branch into southern Europe. Construction had been underway since 2013, when, in April of 2014, a month after Crimea's annexation, the European Commission blocked it. Gazprom may have been outside of EU jurisdiction, but South Stream's point of entry wasn't. The Bulgarian government conceded to EU pressure and withdrew from the project. At a time when EU leadership was being criticized for lackluster sanctions against Russia, Brussels had in fact struck a solid blow against the golden goose of the Russian economy. As part of the ruling, the European Commission proclaimed it would begin diversifying its energy imports to weaken Gazprom's hold on the market. 2 months later, in June, Russia shut down Ukraine's gas supply, claiming the Kiev government was over $1 billion in debt, and Gazprom would not resume its flow until it was paid in full. Kiev needed to find a solution in time to begin stockpiling for a potentially long, uncertain winter. Coming to its aid were Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. The 3 began selling portions of their own Gazprom imports to Ukraine. Moscow issued objections to the move, claiming it was in violation of their contracts and threatened to cut their supplies. Hungary then stopped, while Poland and Slovakia continued in defiance until their supplies were cut. In May of that year, shortly after the EU's decision on South Stream, President Putin and a large Russian delegation went to Shanghai in what came to be dubbed Russia's pivot to Asia. In addition to grand talk of forging closer economic ties, Gazprom arranged a $300 million deal with China. Like a spurred ex-lover eager to show off a new relationship, Moscow sought to play up its new deal with China as representing the beginning of a close partnership. Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller boasted that in a single day, a deal made with China was on par with the level of business the company makes with her largest customer, Germany. In a countermove to the blocking of the South Stream, President Putin made a state visit to Turkey in December of 2014. Putin's visit highlighted the increasing economic ties between the two countries and showcased the opportunity for Turkish agricultural products to fill in for boycotted EU food imports. In place of the now abandoned South Stream, a new pipeline project, the Turk Stream, was proposed as a joint effort with the Turkish government. This alternate route would take place beyond the reach of the EU rules that had blocked the South Stream. Putin was so confident of this deal that 6 months later, during the high fiasco of a Greek bailout, he assured the cash-strapped Athens government of the large sum they would be receiving for allowing the Turk Stream to stretch into Greece. Talk of energy diversification within the EU soon became action. Deals were made to import U.S. shale and gas from the Middle East and Algeria. One of the more brazen efforts to break Gazprom's monopoly in Eastern Europe was undertaken by Lithuania. As with its Baltic neighbors, the country was largely dependent on Russia for its energy. The former Soviet states received 100% of their natural gas from Gazprom. In December 2014, the Lithuanian government purchased a floating liquefied gas terminal. Liquefied gas is a cheap, effective means of shipping natural gas. However, it requires a processing terminal to be turned back into a gas. With Lithuania's ship terminal, which they aptly christened Independence, they're now able to import liquefied gas from Norway, Sweden, Finland, and eventually the US and United Arab Emirates. Lithuanian gas will then be channeled to their Baltic neighbors. The government has also signed an agreement to develop a pipeline to supply gas to Poland, with future plans to expand into Ukraine. Gazprom has issued a protest against this new competitor and has since been accused of attempting to manipulate the gas market to undermine Lithuania's efforts. In January 2015, CEO Miller was sounding cocksure of Gazprom's position. In meeting with the EU's new energy chief, Miller informed him that Ukraine's pipeline contract would be allowed to expire in 2019. If Europe wished to continue to be supplied, they would need to build a new pipeline themselves. Before the year's end, Miller would be singing a very different tune. By the first anniversary of Crimea's annexation in March of 2015, Russia was running out of counter moves. Moscow had sought to show its EU customers they were expandable, seemingly betting that they would reconsider their hardline position. However, the European Union of 2015 was not the same timid organization it had been in 2007. Despite Russia's cooperation in the Minsk II ceasefire the month prior, and the fighting in eastern Ukraine dwindling, Brussels remained on the offense. In April, the EU's competition commissioner issued its first round of charges against Gazprom, citing it with market abuses. The gas giant once more tried to deflect charges with the usual retort, but the commission would not back down. While the EU's efforts to diversify its imports were gaining traction, Russia's attempts to diversify its exports were beginning to unravel. The Turk Stream project ended up being terminated before any construction would begin. Relations between Russia and Turkey dove after a Turkish jet fighter shot down a Russian bomber along the Syrian border, not a year after Putin's state visit. Even without this wildcard event, the Turk Stream project had shown little promise of going forward. Turkey clearly saw Russia was dealing from a position of weakness and stalled a final agreement in its attempt to secure a better deal. Compounding the fallout between the two nations, Turkey's President Erdogan publicly claimed that the Turks had been the ones to ultimately reject the proposal, whereas their Russian counterparts claimed they had in fact abandoned the project after a prolonged deadlock with the Turks. China likewise is thought to have maximized their advantage in dealing with Russia. Despite Putin's boasting, market analysts were skeptical that any gas deal with China would hold much profit for Russia, let alone justify the massive expense of building an eastward pipe stream. Over time, as hype of this partnership waned, the reality that set in proved far less lucrative for Russia. It turned out, Chinese investors prioritized staying on good terms with the EU and the US over market opportunities in Russia. Gazprom has had little luck in reaching subsequent deals with China. In September of 2015, following another failed attempt to reach an export deal with China, Gazprom appeared to have accepted that the tide had turned against it and raised the white flag. That month, the company was quick to sign deals with major EU companies to expand the Nord Stream pipeline across the Baltic Sea into Germany. Having once proclaimed Europe would need to build any future pipelines on their own, Russia officials were now offering to lower gas prices for customers that assisted with funding the Nord Stream, in addition to making concessions to win EU approval. A now chasing Gazprom has even offered to seek a settlement over the EU's antitrust charges. CEO Miller backtracked on his threats to cut off shipments through Ukraine after 2019. Despite all of its previous posturing, Gazprom seems to have conceded that it needed its EU customers more than they needed it. Gazprom will remain a major contributor to Europe's energy sector, yet it can no longer enjoy the dominance and leverage it had before. The company was placed in check by EU cohesion and a willingness of independent state actors to stand up to Russia. The attempts at imposing an energy blockade against Ukraine didn't just fail, they backfired. Gazprom is estimated to have lost close to $6 billion through lost revenue and incurred fines. And yet, events may have unfolded differently were it not for one wildcard factor beyond the reach of politics: weather. The winters of 2014 and 2015 proved mild for Europe, thereby softening the potential impact of an energy crisis. Had it gotten colder, EU members may have very well been far less brazen in challenging the provider of a primary heat source, and history may have taken a different course.